Hello, everyone, and good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, or whenever you are watching this video. Today, we are going to be covering cells, the building blocks of life. And so, the standard that we're going to be working on today is comparing prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells in terms of how their general structures, like the plasma membrane, and their genetic material, like their DNA, and their degree of complexity. So we're going to talk about cells today. Unit 2 is opening up the world of cells. So our essential questions for this lesson are, what theory do scientists use to explain the characteristics of cells? And how do prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells arise? And how do they differ? So we're going to walk into the world of cells today. We just finished Unit 1, where we talked about the elements and the atoms and the biochemical component of living organisms. And we even opened up Unit 2 discussing what it means to be living, what constitutes as a living organism, right? So now we're going to move into talking about these cells and how they sustain life and what components they possess in order for them to live and grow and evolve. So in this lesson, you will be able to explain the cell theory. You will be able to explain the endosymbiont theory. You will be able to compare and contrast prokaryotes and eukaryotes, and you will be able to identify examples of prokaryotes and eukaryotes. So let's hop into it. Welcome to the world of cells. You have access to this entire presentation, so you will be able to click on the link and it will take you to a wonderful Amoeba Sisters video talking about cells and introducing you to cells. Look at these pictures on the screen. What do you think these are pictures of, or what kinds of cells do you think these are? That's just something to think about. In this video, I can tell you right now that this is a picture of tissues. So this is a lot of different cells linked together. These are pictures of red blood cells. And this is a picture of an egg cell getting artificially inseminated. So we have many different kinds of cells, and we're going to talk about those today. So the first thing let's talk about is the cell theory. What is a cell and what is a cell theory, right? So when we're talking about theories in general, we typically regard a theory as being an explanation for something. Okay, so a theory is an explanation for why or how something happens. So the cell theory is how or why, or explaining what cells are and how and why and who they are. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about the first tenet of the cell theory. There are three. The first part of the cell theory tells you what a cell is. A cell is the smallest unit of life. This cell, a cell, whatever kind of cell, is the smallest organism that can carry out all life processes it needs to survive. So while we may be animals, and dogs and cats may be animals, and plants may be animals, we are all made of cells. And there are cells, units, living units smaller than us that are able to survive just like us. So here are some pictures of some cells. This is a single unit. It can carry out all its life processes. And these are single units as well that can carry out life processes they need to survive as well. The second point of the cell theory is that it tells why cells are important, right? Why are cells important? Because all organisms are made of cells. So if you are a living organism, you are made of at least one or more cells. Humans are made up of trillions of cells. Plants are made up of millions and billions of cells. And this sweet little single-celled organism we're going to talk about is made up of one cell. So as long as you're made up of one or multiple cells, you are considered living, and you are considered living. And the last part of the cell theory is that cells come from pre-existing cells. So it tells where they come from. Cells must come from pre-existing cells that already exist. Okay, so pre-existing means that the cell already exists. To be pre-existing, Pre means before, existing means to be there. So pre-exist means to already be there. So when you make cells, or when you derive cells, or when you're growing, your cells are always dividing and making new cells. So those new cells come from pre-existing cells. You don't get cells that fall out of the sky, right? You don't get cells from rain. You don't get cells from brushing your teeth or washing your hair. You don't do that. All of your cells come from pre-existing cells. Just like when you think about a mom and a baby, the baby doesn't fall out of the sky. The mom doesn't wish for a baby and the baby falls out of the sky. The baby comes from the mom. The baby comes from a pre-existing person, right? And so cells have organization, or levels of organization, that we're going to talk about. So the levels of organization for cells, we began this entire this entire course of biology talking about how cells, about how macromolecules made up our bodies and our cells and our macromolecules that we needed to survive. Those macromolecules were made up of elements, right? We talked about carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, but those elements are also made up of molecules and molecules are made up of atoms. So we started in the beginning talking about macromolecules, and guess what? Now we're getting bigger. Now we're looking at the bigger picture. We took our microscope and we honed in on the smallest part of biology, and now we're adding on top of our knowledge and getting to the bigger picture. So this unit, we're going to be talking about organelles and cells, and how our cells come together to make tissues, and how those tissues come together to make organs, and how organs come together to make organ systems, and how multiple organ systems can come together to make an organism. All right, so again, we started small and we're trucking on the way to the bigger picture. All right, so cell organization is important. Again, we all start as atoms and molecules, or macromolecules, that come together to make up our cells. So then our cells come together to make tissues, tissues come together to make organs, organ systems come together to make an individual organism. So here's a eukaryotic cheek cell. So here's a cheek cell, just a cell from inside your cheek. And multiple cheek cells come together to make your cheek tissue. And multiple tongue cells come together to make your tongue tissue. And your tongue and your tissue are, guess what? A part of your mouth. Your mouth is an organ. And your mouth is an organ, a part of maybe the digestive system. And multiple organs, like your mouth and your esophagus and your intestines and your rectum, all of those organs come together to work in an organ system. And the digestive system is just one of your many systems that you use to survive, like your respiratory system, your lymphatic system, your circulatory system, and so on and so forth. So we started out small, and as we add on, we notice that all those tissues, cells, tissues, organs, and organ systems all that come together to help us live and survive. There are two types of cells. So now that we know what cells are, let's talk about the two types of cells. There are two types of cells. There are eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic cells. When you say eukaryotic or prokaryotic, you're describing the type of cell. But when you say eukaryote or prokaryote, you're describing the type of organism as a whole. Okay, so let's talk about these two different kinds of cells and how they came to arise and how they're different and maybe how they're similar too. So there are two types of cells, prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Let's talk about, and all of these cells have organelles, right? So organelles are tiny organs of the cell. Organ is an organ or a specific organ or a specific type of machinery in the cell that helps it perform its job. So an organ is a specific instrument or a specific machinery. So organ is specific machinery, So a specific machinery, and then L means little. Or tiny. Okay, so these are little specific machines. That's what organelles are. They're tiny organs of the cell, just like your specific organelles in your body have specific functions inside the cell. These little tiny organelles have specific functions too. So see, the cells have many different organelles. So again, just like your organs in your body have special functions, your organelles in your cells have special functions too. So just like your heart pumps blood, your heart is an organ and its function is to pump blood. In your cells have organelles that have different functions that help your cells to survive. Okay? So just like your skeleton gives you body structure, or your skin protects you, your insides from the outsides, some of your organelles have membranes or coverings around them that help to protect them too. These are called membrane-bound organelles. Membrane-bound organelles are organelles that have extra coverings around them. Okay? So the first kind of cell is a prokaryotic cell, or the first kind of organism that was theorized to be on Earth was a prokaryote. A prokaryote, you might want to write this in your notes. A prokaryote, a prokaryote, or pro, means first. So prokaryotes were theorized to be the first cells on Earth. Okay. Now this is a theory. We don't know for sure, but this is just a theory. Prokaryotes were theorized to be the first cells on Earth. Pro means first. So whenever you see prokaryotes or when you see pro, think about first. Okay. Prokaryotes are generally smaller and simpler. They're smaller and simpler than eukaryotic cells. So prokaryotes are generally smaller and simpler. They're about 0.1 to 5 micrometers long. This means micrometers. Okay? So prokaryotes are generally smaller and simpler. Because they were considered to be the first cells on Earth, they're small and simple. They didn't need a lot to survive. Earth was pretty hostile, or theorized to be pretty hostile as is. So they didn't need a lot to survive. So they were small and simple and got by how they could. Prokaryotes have no nucleus. A nucleus is one of the organelles that we're going to talk about later. A nucleus, prokaryotes have no nucleus, so they don't have a nucleus, but they do have genetic material called, which is circular DNA, called a plasmid that just floats around in the cytoplasm. Okay, so prokaryotes have no nucleus, but they are living. They do have DNA. They do have genetic material. They do have DNA. They do have DNA. It's circular and it's called a plasmid, and it just floats in the cytoplasm. So it just floats around inside the cell. It's not protected or anything. Okay. Prokaryotes have no membrane-bound organelles. I like to call these MBOs. Membrane-bound organelles. Prokaryotes, those small, simple first cells on Earth, have no membrane-bound organelles. So they don't have any special organs inside that are covered by extra layers. So they don't have all the extra. They don't have membrane-bound organelles. All prokaryotes possess are ribosomes, a cytoplasm, a cell wall, and a cell membrane. Okay? So prokaryotes are super, super simple. And they don't need a whole lot. Since they were the first ones on Earth, they didn't need much to survive. So all they had were ribosomes, cytoplasm, cell wall, and cell membrane. They didn't need a lot of organs or a lot of different organelles in order to survive. They just needed the bare minimum. They only needed a little to survive. Okay? And prokaryotes are typically and usually always unicellular. Okay, so they're typically always unicellular, meaning they're made up of one cell. Ooh. One cell. They're single-celled. Okay. And some examples of some prokaryotes are things like bacteria and even archaea. Bacteria and archaea are examples of prokaryotes. So bacteria have been here for a while, or are theorized to have been here for a while. So recap, prokaryotes were the first cells, or theorized to be the first cells on Earth. Pro means first. So since they were first, they were probably generally smaller and simpler. They didn't need a whole lot to survive. They had no nucleus. The way I like to remember this is that pro equals no. So pro, no, nucleus. Okay? And since they're small and simple, they only had 4 major things they needed: ribosomes, cytoplasms, cell walls, and cell membranes. They're typically unicellular, and bacteria and archaea are examples. Okay? Now, we know that prokaryotes were the first, or theorized to be the first cells on Earth, but are you single cellular? Am I single cellular? Is your dog or your cat or even your little wall plant, are those organisms single cellular? No, they're made up of multiple cells, so they're multicellular. How did we get this way though? How do we go from prokaryote to eukaryote? We know there are 2 different types of cells, but how do we even get there? Well, scientists use the endosymbiotic theory to explain this. The endosymbiotic theory, this is one of your questions, you might want to listen to this. The endosymbiotic theory is defined as the theory that scientists use to explain how the first simple prokaryotic cells on Earth evolved to give rise to large, complex eukaryotic cells. Okay? So basically, this was a theory that scientists used to say how we went from being small and simple to large and complex. Okay? So how do we do that? So we know that the first cells on Earth were theorized to be prokaryotic cells. So here were our first prokaryotic cells, or here was the theory. Over time, the plasma membrane, the cell membrane that the prokaryotic cell already had, it started to randomly fold inside or fold into itself. So over time, it started to fold into itself and create like a little pocket. And the DNA, it folded around the DNA. So it folded around the DNA. And it enclosed the DNA. It folded around the DNA, and now the DNA was inside what would become later the nucleus. So scientists theorize that over time, the plasma membrane that the prokaryotic cell had kind of like folded into itself, like, hold up, I need to fold into itself. And the DNA happened to get caught into it. So now the DNA was enclosed in a nucleus because that plasma membrane kind of formed that nucleus inside the cell. But look at this. Over time, though, this cell started to swallow smaller bacteria that could do other jobs. So smaller prokaryotes that could do other jobs, this cell was like, you know what? I could use you. Let me eat you. So the larger prokaryote, this is still a single cell, ate smaller prokaryotes and said, hey, I could use your machinery. And in turn, I won't eat you and kill you. You can still live with me. We can live in an apartment together. This is my house, but you can still get you a room. So this new, this prokaryotic cell engulfed other smaller bacteria and made room for them. And over time, this cell has now become more complex because look, now it has more parts. Now it has more, and it needs more space. Before, the cell was just living in a house by himself. After he started evolving and changing, he needed more space and he was more complex. And so now these smaller prokaryotes perform their functions inside this larger prokaryote and helps it out. While the larger prokaryote gives the smaller prokaryotes a home, the smaller prokaryotes help the larger prokaryote to survive. And because it was becoming more and more complex and that nucleus formed, it now can be classified as a eukaryote because it has a nucleus. So again, let me go over it one more time really quick. Really quickly. Prokaryotes were theorized to be the first cells on Earth. The first cells on Earth, or theorized to be. And so they were small and simple, and they only had a cell wall, a cell membrane, ribosomes, and cytoplasm. They didn't have any other types of organelles or organization. It was just the simple small cell. Randomly, over time, the nucleus forms by folding the plasma membrane. So over time, the plasma membrane that the prokaryote already had starts to just randomly fold and fold around the DNA that just is randomly floating. And so this forms the nucleus. So now we have an early eukaryote because it has a nucleus now. It's no longer a prokaryote with no nucleus. It's an early eukaryote. But we're not done. Over time, this larger cell, this larger primitive eukaryotic cell says, I need more help. And I see that these smaller prokaryotes can do different jobs. So let me eat them. Let me engulf them. Let me take them inside my cell. Endo means inside. Let me take them inside my cell. Let me eat them. Let me engulf them so they can do work for me. So these smaller cells, these smaller prokaryotic cells did work inside this larger cell. But guess what? The larger cell didn't break them down and kill them. They worked together. So they worked in symbiosis. They worked together. So they worked together. So the endosymbiotic theory is that these smaller prokaryotes work together inside a larger cell and over time evolve to give rise to larger, more complex cells. Okay? So then now let's talk about eukaryotes. Now that we know how eukaryotes were theorized to come about, eukaryotes are the other type of cell that exists on this earth. And they're typically larger and more complex. They have way than prokaryotic cells. They have way more that are involved in their processes. Eu means true nucleus. So eukaryotes have a true nucleus, whereas prokaryotes were the first cells with no nucleus. So eukaryotes are generally larger and more complex. So they're about 5 to 100 micrometers. They're about 5 to 100 micrometers. Okay, so they're a lot larger. They do have a nucleus. So you do have a nucleus. Okay. Eukaryotes do have a nucleus. The nucleus is where the DNA is organized in chromosomes. So the nucleus is where the DNA is held. Remember, in prokaryotes, the nucleus was just floating around wherever it needed to go. I mean, the DNA was floating around wherever it needed to go. However, in a eukaryotic cell, your DNA is saved in a nucleus. It's protected in a nucleus. Okay, and it's organized as chromosomes. So in prokaryotes, the DNA was circular as a plasmid. But in eukaryotes, your DNA is organized in chromosomes, in linear chromosomes. Okay? Eukaryotes do have membrane-bound organelles. So eukaryotes do have many different types of tiny organs that have special extra coverings around them. Okay, eukaryotes can be multicellular or unicellular. So eukaryotes can be made of many cells. They can be made of many cells, or they can be made of one cell. While prokaryotes can only be made of one cell, eukaryotes can be multicellular or unicellular. And there are 4 types of eukaryotes. There are plants, animals, fungi, and protists. So plants, animals, fungi, and protists all have nuclei. Okay. So here are some organelles that we're going to talk about in the coming days for this unit. So some organelles that exist inside a eukaryotic cell are things like nuclei or a nucleus or a nucleolus, mitochondria, endoplasmic reticulum, ribosome, cytoplasm, chloroplast, vacuole, plasma membrane. So think about this for me. This is something for you to be thinking about. We know that prokaryotes only contain 4 organelles, or 4 things they need to survive. However, eukaryotes are more complex and they contain all of these organelles. Do you see any organelles that prokaryotes and eukaryotes have in common? Think about that. All right, that is my session for today. Please let me know if you have any questions, and please complete your comprehension questions on Canvas. Thank you and have a wonderful day.